In the summer of 1777, in a stone manor house nestled along the fog-draped banks of the Rhine River near Ingolstadt, Bavaria, a servant named Heinrich Müller stumbled upon something that would haunt him until his dying breath. While clearing debris from a sealed cellar after a lightning strike had cracked open its entrance, he discovered a metal lockbox containing documents written in a cipher he could not comprehend, alongside vials of a crystalline substance that seemed to pulse with an inner luminescence even in complete darkness. The papers bore a symbol he had seen before, a pyramid with 13 steps crowned by an unblinking eye, carved into the manor's foundation stones, hidden beneath layers of plaster and time. This discovery, which Müller reported to local authorities before vanishing without trace 3 days later, remained classified in Bavarian state archives for over 2 centuries, stamped with a warning in Latin that translated simply to, "Let the buried remain buried." What would drive humans to cross the final boundary of ethics? The world of the late 18th century trembled on the precipice of revolution and enlightenment, a time when the old orders of monarchy and church faced challenges from secret lodges of freethinkers, philosophical societies, and clandestine groups who believed that humanity's destiny lay not in divine providence, but in the perfection of human will and intellect. Across Europe, from the salons of Paris to the universities of German principalities, a hunger for hidden knowledge consumed the educated elite. They sought not merely political transformation, but something far more profound: the secrets of nature itself, the mechanisms of consciousness, and the keys to transcending human limitation. Into this ferment of ideas emerged whispers of a society that went beyond mere philosophy, one that claimed to possess methods of reshaping human nature from its very foundations. The first concrete evidence appeared in 1776, when a Bavarian official named Johann Adam Weishaupt, a professor of canon law at the University of Ingolstadt, founded what he called the Order of the Illuminati, presenting it publicly as a progressive alternative to the conservative Freemason lodges. But that public face concealed a structure far more complex and disturbing than anyone suspected. What appeared as innovation hid a darkness the world wasn't ready to face. Before we descend deeper into this labyrinth of secrecy and forbidden knowledge, tell me, where are you watching from and what time is it right now? Are you alone or is someone nearby? Because what you're about to discover might change how you see the foundations of the modern world, the institutions you trust, and the very nature of how power operates in the shadows between official history and suppressed truth. This is not a story of simple conspiracy, but of an actual experiment in human transformation that left traces in archives, testimonies, and the psychological scars of those who survived its inner circles. The origin of this society emerged from a single obsessive question that consumed Weishaupt during his years studying theology and philosophy. If the church could shape human behavior through ritual, doctrine, and psychological conditioning, why couldn't an enlightened vanguard do the same? But with scientific precision and without the constraints of religious morality? His answer would lead to the creation of a recruitment and indoctrination system so sophisticated that it anticipated the psychological manipulation, techniques that wouldn't be formally studied until the 20th century. Weishaupt began with 5 trusted students in May of 1776, meeting in absolute secrecy in candlelit chambers beneath the university. The initial structure appeared innocent enough. Study groups focused on philosophy, science, and rational thought. But Weishaupt had designed something far more intricate. Each recruit underwent a carefully staged initiation process divided into 13 degrees, each revealing progressively more disturbing aspects of the society's true purpose. The outer degrees focused on self-improvement and rational humanism, attracting idealistic young men from aristocratic and intellectual families across Bavaria and beyond. They studied Enlightenment texts, debated political reform, and believed they were part of a benevolent brotherhood working toward human progress. But advancement to the inner degrees required something else entirely: a willingness to abandon conventional morality, to view humanity not as sacred but as raw material to be shaped, and to accept that the end of perfecting mankind justified any means necessary. Documents recovered from raids on Illuminati lodges in 1785 revealed instruction manuals for psychological manipulation, techniques for identifying and exploiting individual weaknesses, and a systematic program for infiltrating positions of influence throughout European society. Members were taught to create dependency relationships, to isolate recruits from outside influence, and to gradually reshape their perception of reality through carefully controlled information and ritual experience. The most disturbing element lay in what Weishaupt called the experimental chamber. a program described in fragments of seized correspondence but never fully documented in official reports. References suggest that select members of the highest degrees participated in trials designed to test the limits of psychological conditioning and physiological manipulation. These experiments allegedly involved sensory deprivation, induced altered states through chemical compounds derived from ergot fungus and other botanicals, and ritualized scenarios designed to break down and rebuild the participants' sense of identity and moral constraint. One fragment, preserved in the Bavarian State Library, describes a process called the dissolution, in which initiates spent days in complete darkness while being fed a carefully calibrated diet designed to heighten suggestibility. During this period, they heard voices reading texts that merged philosophical ideas with commands that embedded themselves deep in the unconscious mind. When they emerged, according to the account, they demonstrated a remarkable capacity to execute complex tasks without questioning their moral implications and showed an almost mechanical obedience to the directives of their superiors. The society expanded with astonishing speed through the late 1770s and early 1780s. Weishaupt recruited influential figures including Baron Adolf von Kneige, a skilled organizer who helped infiltrate Illuminati members into existing Freemason lodges throughout German territories, France, Austria, and Italy. By 1784, estimates suggested the order had between 1,500 and 2,000 members, occupying positions in government ministries, universities, military commands, and even religious institutions. They communicated through coded letters using cipher systems of remarkable sophistication for the era, employed pseudonyms drawn from classical antiquity. Weishaupt himself used the name Spartacus, and maintained elaborate cover identities. The structure operated on the principle of compartmentalization, with members at lower degrees having no knowledge of higher-level activities and higher-level operatives maintaining multiple false identities, even within the organization itself. This architecture of secrecy made it nearly impossible for outsiders to understand the organization's true scope or purpose, and difficult even for most members to comprehend the entity they had joined. But secrecy on such a scale creates vulnerability. In 1784, a courier carrying Illuminati documents from Frankfurt to Paris was struck by lightning while traveling through Regensburg. The documents he carried, including detailed membership lists, cipher keys, and fragments of the experimental protocols, fell into the hands of Bavarian authorities. What they revealed shocked even the cynical bureaucrats of the Bavarian court. Here was evidence of a conspiracy that extended beyond political intrigue into something that resembled a systematic program for the transformation of human consciousness itself. The documents described methods for identifying individuals with specific psychological profiles, those combining high intelligence with deep-seated resentments, ambitious nature with moral flexibility, and capacity for compartmentalized thinking. They outlined recruitment approaches tailored to exploit each personality type, techniques for gradual desensitization to ethical boundaries, and a final stage process described only as the perfection in which subjects allegedly achieved a state of what Weishaupt called enlightened instrumentality, the capacity to serve the society's aims with perfect efficiency, unencumbered by doubt, guilt, or independent judgment. The Bavarian government moved swiftly and brutally. On June 22, 1784, Elector Karl Theodor issued an edict banning all secret societies. Follow-up raids on known Illuminati meeting places in 1785 yielded thousands of pages of documents, ritual objects, and chemical substances whose purpose remained unclear to investigators. Weishaupt fled Bavaria, eventually finding refuge in Gotha under the protection of Duke Ernest II. Many members recanted and provided testimony, though their accounts often conflicted or seemed deliberately obscured. Some described the society as nothing more than a philosophical discussion group. Others, particularly those who had reached the 7th degree or higher, spoke of experiences that bordered on the incomprehensible. Ceremonies involving mirrors and mathematical patterns designed to induce trance states, exposure to substances that caused visions of geometric entities and dissolution of self-boundary, and training in what they called the art of the double mind, in which one could hold contradictory beliefs simultaneously and act on whichever served the immediate purpose. Several testified to participating in experiments they could not fully remember, waking from induced states with gaps in their memory, and a persistent feeling that something fundamental had been altered in their perception and volition. The official investigation concluded in 1787, declaring the Illuminati effectively destroyed. The Bavarian government published seized documents as a warning to other nations about the dangers of secret societies. Weishaupt himself, now in exile, published defensive treatises claiming his society aimed only at moral and political reform, dismissing the more extreme revelations as fabrications or misunderstandings. And there the official story ends. A failed conspiracy, its leader in exile, its members scattered or recanted, its brief moment of influence over. But that ending was itself an illusion, perhaps the most successful deception the Illuminati ever achieved, because the documents published by Bavaria represented only a fraction of what had been discovered, and certain files, those detailing the experimental protocols and the identities of the highest-ranking members, remained classified under orders that ensured they would not surface for generations, if ever. The truth hidden within those classified files would not surface through official channels, but through the fragmentary testimonies of men whose minds had been irrevocably altered by what they experienced in the Illuminati's inner sanctum. In 1789, as revolutionary fervor consumed France and the old order collapsed across Europe, a former member named Franz Xaver von Zwack, who had served as Weishaupt's second-in-command before his arrest, began experiencing what physicians of the era diagnosed as acute melancholia and nervous disorder. Confined to his estate under house arrest, Zwack filled notebook after notebook with fragmentary recollections that suggested his participation in experiments far beyond what the public documents revealed. These private writings, discovered among his effects after his death in 1795, and held by his descendants until their donation to a private archive in 1923, described a program Weishaupt called Project Prometheus, an attempt to artificially induce what he termed the illuminated state, a condition of consciousness in which the rational mind achieved complete dominance over emotion, instinct, and moral constraint. Zwack's account, written in prose that alternated between clinical precision and hallucinatory imagery, suggested that the highest initiates did not merely study philosophy, but underwent a systematic process designed to fundamentally rewire their cognitive and emotional architecture. The methodology drew from sources as diverse as alchemical texts, emerging theories of animal magnetism promoted by Franz Mesmer, and Weishaupt's own observations of religious ecstasy, and its capacity to override normal psychological barriers. The process began with isolation and sensory manipulation, techniques that modern psychology would later recognize as extraordinarily effective at inducing suggestibility and breaking down established patterns of thought. Initiates selected for the experimental track, never more than a dozen at any given time according to Zwack's account, underwent a preparatory phase lasting 3 months. During this period, they maintained strict dietary restrictions designed to alter brain chemistry, abstaining from meat and consuming instead carefully measured quantities of grains, certain mushrooms, and tinctures whose exact composition Zwack claimed not to fully understand, but which he believed contained extracts of ergot, henbane, and other psychoactive botanicals known to medieval herbalists and witch cult practitioners. They slept in cycles deliberately disrupted to induce a state of chronic exhaustion that lowered psychological defenses, and they spent hours daily in darkened chambers staring at geometric patterns painted on walls, spirals, concentric circles, interlocking triangles, while listening to repetitive chanting in Latin and Greek that embedded specific phrases deep into their consciousness. Zwack described the transition to the active phase with a mixture of clinical detail and obvious psychological trauma that bled through even his attempts at objective documentation. Selected subjects entered what Weishaupt called the Chamber of Dissolution, a windowless room in the subterranean levels of a manor house outside Ingolstadt that members knew only by its coded designation, Site Omega. The chamber's walls were covered entirely in mirrors set at precise mathematical angles, creating infinite reflections that disoriented spatial perception. At its center stood a chair fitted with restraints disguised as ritual regalia. Leather straps worked with alchemical symbols. The subject, dressed in white robes and with head partially hooded to restrict peripheral vision, would be seated and given a measured dose of the compound Weishaupt called aqua lucis, water of light. Within minutes, according to Zwack's account, the substance would begin its work, dilating pupils to painful sensitivity, accelerating heart rate, and inducing a state of consciousness that he struggled to describe adequately. Reality became fluid, he wrote. Boundaries between self and environment dissolved, and the geometric patterns embedded in their preparation phase began to manifest as living entities that spoke in the voices of their instructors, commanding obedience and promising transformation. During these induced states, which could last anywhere from 6 to 18 hours, Weishaupt and his inner circle would enter the chamber and conduct what they termed the Reformation, a process of psychological reconstruction through guided experience and embedded command. They employed techniques that anticipated modern hypnotherapy and trauma-based conditioning, using the subject's chemically heightened suggestibility to implant behavioral triggers, reframe moral frameworks, and establish loyalty mechanisms that operated below conscious awareness. Zwack confessed in his private writings that he had served as both subject and administrator of this process, experiencing the dissolution himself before helping to guide others through it. The experience, he wrote, left him with a peculiar divided consciousness. Part of him remained his original self, viewing his actions with horror and incomprehension, while another part operated with mechanical efficiency in service of the society's aims, untroubled by ethical consideration or emotional attachment. This splitting of the psyche, he suggested, was not an accidental byproduct but the intended result, creating individuals who could function in normal society while harboring a hidden self that activated under specific circumstances. The evidence for these experiments existed not only in Zwack's traumatized recollections, but in the behavior patterns exhibited by high-ranking members after the society's official dissolution. Multiple former Illuminati members displayed remarkably similar psychological symptoms in subsequent years. Episodes of dissociation, reports of missing time and fragmented memories, sudden shifts between apparently incompatible personality states, and an inability to fully account for their actions during their period of deepest involvement. A Bavarian physician named Johann Caspar Lavater, who examined several former members at the request of worried families, documented cases of what he called induced somnambulism in a 1788 treatise that was quickly suppressed by authorities who feared public panic about the society's true capabilities. Lavater noted that subjects could be triggered into altered states by specific combinations of words, gestures, or visual symbols, during which they would execute complex behaviors with no subsequent memory of having done so. He theorized that the Illuminati had discovered methods of creating what he termed compartments of consciousness, allowing for the coexistence of multiple behavioral programs within a single individual. The investigation that followed the society's exposure struggled with the question of how extensively these experimental subjects had infiltrated positions of power and whether their conditioning remained active after the organization's collapse. Government interrogators faced a maddening paradox. Subjects genuinely seemed to have no conscious memory of their deepest involvement, yet documentary evidence and testimony from lower-level members confirmed their participation in activities they now denied or could not recall. Some investigators concluded that Weishaupt had achieved his ultimate goal of creating agents who could operate within his network while maintaining complete deniability, protected by genuine amnesia for their own actions. Others suspected that the memory loss itself was a defensive mechanism, a final layer of protection implanted during the Reformation process that activated automatically if a member faced serious exposure risk. A third faction, their reports carefully buried in classified archives, believed something even more disturbing, that the experimental subjects had been fundamentally altered in ways that persisted beyond the society's dissolution, creating a population of individuals who might activate under the right conditions even decades later, their original programming lying dormant like seeds waiting for the proper season. The deeper investigators dug into the Illuminati's structure, the more they confronted evidence that Weishaupt had not been working alone in developing these techniques. Correspondence fragments suggested consultation with figures whose identities remained concealed behind elaborate pseudonyms, individuals referred to only as the prior adepts, who apparently possessed knowledge of consciousness manipulation that predated the Illuminati by centuries. References appeared to techniques drawn from Sufi mystical practices, Jesuit spiritual exercises twisted to psychological control purposes, and methods allegedly preserved from ancient mystery cults of Greece and Rome. One particularly disturbing document, a letter from Weishaupt to an unknown recipient designated only as Magus, discussed the discovery of what he called pattern languages, specific sequences of symbols, sounds, and movements that could bypass conscious cognitive processing and directly influence the deeper structures of mind and nervous system. These pattern languages, Weishaupt claimed, had been encoded into various esoteric traditions throughout history, their true purpose concealed beneath layers of mystical interpretation, waiting for someone with the insight to recognize them for what they actually were, tools of neurological engineering developed by unknown predecessors and preserved in symbolic form. This suggestion that the Illuminati represented not an unprecedented innovation but a rediscovery or continuation of far older programs of human modification troubled investigators far more than the idea of Weishaupt as a lone genius of manipulation. It implied the existence of a continuous tradition of forbidden knowledge, passed through generations via carefully selected initiates, manifesting periodically in different forms and organizations, but maintaining consistent core methodologies. The Bavarian authorities, already overwhelmed by political instability and the approaching revolutionary chaos, made a fateful decision. Rather than pursuing these implications to their conclusion, they chose containment. The most disturbing documents were classified under the highest security designation. Witnesses whose testimony ventured too far into the experimental protocols were discredited or quietly committed to asylums. The official narrative emphasized the Illuminati as a failed political conspiracy, dangerous but comprehensible, rather than as practitioners of techniques that challenged fundamental assumptions about consciousness, will, and human nature. This decision to limit the investigation's scope and suppress its most troubling findings would have consequences that echoed through subsequent centuries, as fragments of Illuminati methodology surfaced in unexpected contexts, suggesting that the knowledge Weishaupt had gathered or rediscovered had not disappeared with his exile. By 1790, Weishaupt himself had fallen silent, living under the protection of Duke Ernest II, and producing only defensive philosophical writings that carefully avoided any substantive discussion of the order's inner workings. He maintained absolute silence about the experimental programs until his death in 1830, leaving behind encrypted journals that his family kept sealed for generations. When a portion of these journals finally surfaced in the 1970s, through a descendant's donation to a German university archive, they revealed a man still obsessed with his failed project, but now viewing it through the lens of decades of reflection. The decoded passages, translated and analyzed by a small circle of academic researchers whose findings were published only in obscure journals, showed Weishaupt expressing both pride in his achievements and horror at their implications. He had proven, he wrote, that human consciousness was far more malleable than contemporary philosophy assumed. That personality and moral framework were not fixed essences but constructs that could be dismantled and rebuilt with the right techniques. But he had also discovered something that troubled him deeply in his later years, that the process of reformation, once initiated, could not be fully reversed, and that subjects who underwent deep conditioning often experience long-term psychological consequences he had not anticipated. They developed, he noted, a peculiar inability to sustain authentic emotional connections, viewing even their closest relationships through a lens of strategic utility. They showed heightened capacity for compartmentalized thinking, but decreased ability to achieve integrated selfhood. And most disturbing to Weishaupt in his reflective years, they reported a persistent sense of being observed or guided by an external intelligence, a feeling he initially dismissed as paranoid delusion until multiple subjects, unknown to each other, reported virtually identical experiences of an unseen presence that seemed to operate through their decisions without their conscious awareness. This revelation suggested that Weishaupt's experiments might have achieved success in ways he had not intended and could not control. Rather than creating enlightened servants of the society's rational aims, he may have opened channels in human consciousness that allowed for influence by something beyond his theoretical framework. Whether an emergent property of the collective unconscious, a genuine external intelligence, or simply a psychological artifact created by his manipulation techniques that took on independent operational characteristics within the subjects' minds. His later journals expressed profound unease about this possibility and included oblique warnings about the danger of opening doors in the architecture of awareness without understanding what rooms lie beyond or what might enter through them. These passages read less like the philosophical speculations of an Enlightenment thinker than like the warnings of someone who had accidentally trespassed into territories of consciousness that human understanding was not prepared to navigate safely. Yet Weishaupt never renounced his belief in the fundamental validity of his approach or expressed genuine remorse for the suffering his experiments caused. He maintained to his final entries that the project had been necessary, that humanity's evolution required breaking through the limitations of conventional consciousness, and that his only regret was failing to perfect the process before external circumstances forced its termination. The true climax of the Illuminati story emerged not in the dramatic raids of 1785 or Weishaupt's exile, but in the decades that followed, as investigators and historians began to trace the dispersal patterns of former members and the strange constellation of events that seemed to follow in their wake. Between 1790 and 1848, Europe experienced a cascade of revolutions, philosophical movements, and the emergence of new secret societies that bore unmistakable structural similarities to the Illuminati's organizational design. Former members, despite their public recantations, appeared in key positions during the French Revolution's most radical phases. The Jacobin Club's methods of psychological control over its members, the systematic use of ritual and symbolism to maintain group cohesion, and the capacity to motivate individuals toward actions that violated their previous moral frameworks, all echoed techniques documented in the seized Illuminati papers. Historians who studied these connections in the 20th century, particularly those with access to previously classified state archives, noted patterns suggesting not random influence, but coordinated action, as though some portion of Weishaupt's network had survived underground, its conditioning intact, its members activated by circumstances or signals that remained opaque to external observation. The most concrete evidence of this continuity came from an unexpected source in 1823, when a French police investigator named Eugène François Vidocq, himself a former criminal turned founder of the first modern detective agency, encountered a case that led him into direct collision with what he believed to be surviving Illuminati operatives. Vidocq had been hired by a wealthy Parisian family to investigate the strange behavior of their son, a promising young lawyer named Charles Augustin, who had fallen under the influence of a philosophical society calling itself the Lodge of Perfect Union. Augustin's personality had changed dramatically over 6 months. He became emotionally detached from his family, disposed of a significant inheritance to the Lodge's projects, and began speaking in phrases that seemed rehearsed or implanted, rather than organically arising from his thoughts. When Vidocq infiltrated the Lodge's meetings, he witnessed ceremonies that incorporated elements identical to those described in published accounts of Illuminati rituals, including the use of geometric visual patterns, repetitive chanting in dead languages, and a graduated initiation structure that concealed its true nature from outer members. More disturbing, Vidocq observed the administration of a liquid to initiates preparing for advancement to inner degrees, a substance served in silver chalices and consumed in a ceremonial context that induced visible alterations in consciousness within minutes of ingestion. Vidocq's investigation, documented in his private case files but never publicly reported during his lifetime, uncovered a network of similar lodges operating across France, Prussia, and the Austrian Empire, all maintaining careful separation to avoid detection, but sharing identical ritual elements and organizational structures. When he attempted to expose this network to French authorities, he encountered resistance that suggested official protection or infiltration. His reports disappeared from police archives. Witnesses he had cultivated suddenly recanted their testimony or vanished. And Vidocq himself experienced a series of threats and strange incidents. Anonymous letters that referenced details of his past only he should know. Surveillance by individuals who seemed to anticipate his movements. And finally, a near-fatal poisoning at a cafe he frequented. An incident officially attributed to accidental food contamination, but which Vidocq believed represented a calculated warning. He abandoned the investigation and never spoke publicly of its findings, but his private journals, discovered after his death in 1857 and eventually deposited in the French National Archives, contained a chilling assessment. The Illuminati had not been destroyed, Vidocq concluded, but had successfully executed the ultimate deception, allowing its public face to be demolished while preserving its essential methods, and a core cadre of conditioned operatives who could rebuild the network across generations, adapting its external form to each new era while maintaining the same fundamental program of consciousness manipulation and social infiltration. The physical evidence supporting these conclusions accumulated in fragments across the 19th century. Chemical analyses conducted on substances seized from lodges suspected of Illuminati connections revealed compounds containing ergot alkaloids, tropane derivatives from plants in the nightshade family, and other psychoactive materials whose combination suggested sophisticated pharmacological knowledge. Architectural studies of buildings associated with these groups discovered hidden chambers designed with acoustic properties that enhanced certain frequencies while dampening others, arrangements that research in the 20th century would show capable of inducing altered states through sound vibration alone. Most tellingly, medical records from institutions across Europe documented a consistent pattern of psychological casualties, individuals who had been members of secretive, philosophical or occult societies and subsequently developed the distinctive symptoms of dissociation, memory fragmentation, and personality splitting that characterized subjects of the original Illuminati experiments. These cases appeared with statistical regularity, far exceeding what chance distribution would predict, suggesting ongoing experimental activity that produced a steady stream of psychological damage, even as it successfully conditioned other subjects who remained functional and undetected. The motive behind this multi-generational project remained subject to debate among the limited number of researchers who accessed the classified materials. Weishaupt's stated ideology emphasized rational enlightenment and human perfectibility, but his methods revealed a darker obsession with control and the exercise of power through manipulation of consciousness itself. Some analysts believed the true purpose was political, the creation of an invisible network of influence agents who could shape historical events while remaining undetectable to conventional investigation. Others saw evidence of something more esoteric, a genuine attempt to force human evolution toward a new mode of consciousness that transcended conventional limitations, regardless of the cost in individual suffering or autonomy. A third interpretation, advanced by researchers examining the pattern language references in Weishaupt's private correspondence, suggested the most disturbing possibility, that Weishaupt and his prior adepts believed they were not inventing new techniques but recovering and implementing knowledge from an earlier cycle of human civilization, following instructions encoded in ancient texts and mystery traditions, serving purposes they themselves might not fully comprehend. This interpretation implied that the Illuminati's founders might themselves have been conditioned operatives of an even older program, executing directives embedded in their consciousness through their study of esoteric materials that served as carriers of information across historical discontinuities. The media coverage of Illuminati-related discoveries and theories over the subsequent 2 centuries followed a predictable pattern of sensationalization, followed by official debunking. When the Bavarian government published seized documents in 1787, European newspapers printed sensational accounts of atheistic conspirators seeking to overthrow all legitimate authority, mixing genuine revelations with exaggerated claims that made the entire subject seem like paranoid fantasy. This pattern repeated throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. Periodic exposés of secret society activities would generate public alarm. Then official investigations would conclude that the evidence had been overstated or misinterpreted, and the subject would fade from public attention until the next exposure cycle. This oscillation between revelation and dismissal served to inoculate the public against taking the evidence seriously, creating a situation where the most disturbing documented facts existed in published form, but were widely disbelieved because they appeared alongside wild speculations and unfounded claims. Whether this outcome resulted from deliberate information warfare strategy or emerged organically from the interaction between sensational journalism and official defensiveness remained impossible to determine. But the effect was the same. Genuine evidence of consciousness manipulation experiments and secret society networks became associated with conspiracy theorists and marginalized researchers, protecting the activities from serious mainstream investigation. The families of identified Illuminati members experienced trauma that persisted across generations. Those whose relatives had undergone the deeper experimental protocols reported consistent patterns of psychological damage that affected not only the subjects themselves, but their children and grandchildren. The subjects often proved incapable of normal parental bonding, treating their families with the same strategic calculation they applied to all relationships. Children of deeply conditioned members described growing up with parents who seemed to be performing family roles rather than experiencing genuine emotional connection, who could shift between personas depending on context, and who occasionally displayed frightening episodes of dissociation or behavioral changes triggered by seemingly random stimuli. Some family lines showed elevated rates of schizophrenia, dissociative disorders, and other psychological conditions that suggested either genetic predisposition activated by parental trauma or possible transgenerational effects of the chemical compounds used in the experiments. Descendants who learned of their ancestors' involvement often reported feeling a profound sense of violation. Not only had their relatives been manipulated, but the effects had rippled through family systems in ways that shaped the psychological environment of subsequent generations, who had no knowledge of the original cause. Beyond the immediate families, the broader social impact manifested in the normalization of certain forms of psychological manipulation that first emerged in documented form through the Illuminati's techniques. Methods of graduated initiation, compartmentalized knowledge structures, use of ritual and symbol to maintain group cohesion, exploitation of altered states for behavioral modification. All these appeared first in the Illuminati documents and subsequently became standard features of various political movements, religious cults, intelligence agency programs, and even commercial marketing strategies. The 20th century saw the formal development of mind control research through programs like the CIA's MKUltra project, which explored techniques remarkably similar to those pioneered by Weishaupt: sensory deprivation, chemical induction of altered states, trauma-based conditioning, and the creation of dissociated personality states. When congressional investigations exposed MKUltra in the 1970s, some researchers noted the historical parallels and suggested that modern intelligence agencies might have discovered the Illuminati documents in captured Nazi archives, as Nazi intelligence had systematically collected occult and secret society materials throughout the war. Whether this represented independent parallel development or actual transmission of techniques across 2 centuries could not be definitively established, but the similarity of methodologies was striking and suggested that Weishaupt had indeed discovered or rediscovered principles of consciousness manipulation that proved reproducible across different historical contexts. The current status of Illuminati-derived knowledge and methodology remains deliberately obscured by classification protocols, academic gatekeeping, and the protective camouflage of public disbelief. Most of the original documents seized in the 1780s remain in state archives with access restrictions, available only to credentialed researchers who must justify their interest to institutional review boards. The most explicit materials relating to the experimental protocols have never been published in complete form, with historians who have reviewed them generally declining to discuss the contents in detail, citing either security concerns or the disturbing nature of the material. Descendant organizations, if they exist, have learned from the Illuminati's mistakes. They maintain no centralized leadership, create no permanent documentary record, and structure themselves to ensure that exposure of any single node reveals nothing about the broader network. Intelligence agencies in multiple nations maintain specialized research units focused on consciousness manipulation, psychological warfare, and what are euphemistically termed influence operations, all employing techniques whose lineage traces to the methodologies first systematically documented in the Illuminati papers. And, perhaps most significantly, the basic insight that drove Weishaupt's experiments, that human consciousness is malleable, that personality is a construct rather than an essence, and that systematic application of specific techniques can reshape cognition, emotion, and behavior, has been validated by modern neuroscience and psychology. Stripped of its sinister context and presented as value-neutral, scientific knowledge that could be applied for beneficial or harmful purposes, depending on the user's intent. The question that emerged from this long history was not whether the Illuminati existed, or whether Weishaupt conducted experiments in consciousness manipulation. The documentary evidence settled those matters beyond reasonable dispute. The real question concerned how far the techniques developed in 1777 had spread, how many individuals and organizations had subsequently implemented them, and whether the original program had evolved into something that operated at scales and through mechanisms that would be unrecognizable to its founder. How far would humanity go for control? The Illuminati's answer had been unambiguous, as far as the technology of manipulation would allow, limited only by practical constraints rather than ethical boundaries. Every subsequent generation had inherited that answer, along with progressively more sophisticated tools for implementing it. The technologies of neurochemistry, behavioral psychology, mass media, digital surveillance, and data-driven persuasion had expanded the possibilities for consciousness manipulation far beyond what Weishaupt could have imagined. while the basic principles he documented remained operationally valid. The ultimate horror was not that a small group in 18th century Bavaria had conducted forbidden experiments, but that those experiments had proven successful enough to be worth repeating, refining, and scaling across centuries, creating a world where the manipulation of consciousness had become so normalized that most people no longer recognized it as manipulation at all. So I leave you with this question to consider as you close this window and return to your daily existence. How many of the thoughts you believe to be your own actually originated in your consciousness? And how many were placed there through techniques whose ancestry traces back to that stone manor on the Rhine, where Heinrich Müller discovered the lockbox that should have remained buried? When you feel sudden certainty about political positions, when you experience urgent desires for products or experiences, when you find yourself acting in ways that contradict your stated values but seem compelling in the moment, are these expressions of authentic selfhood or activations of conditioning you cannot perceive because it was designed to operate below conscious awareness? The evidence suggests that the architecture of manipulation built by the Illuminati and refined by their successors has become the invisible infrastructure of modern consciousness, so thoroughly integrated into the environment that questioning its existence seems like paranoid delusion, even as its effects shape every choice you believe you freely make. If this exploration has troubled you, if you find yourself looking at familiar certainties with new suspicion, then perhaps you have glimpsed what Weishaupt's subjects experienced in the Chamber of Dissolution. The terrifying recognition that the self you inhabit might be a construction rather than a discovery, assembled by forces whose purposes remain concealed behind the illusion of your autonomy. If you found value in this investigation into one of history's most disturbing experiments in human consciousness, help others discover it by sharing this video with those who are ready to question the foundations of their own mental autonomy. Subscribe to this channel for more explorations of the hidden mechanisms that shaped our world and continue to operate beneath the surface of official narratives. And most importantly, leave a comment sharing your location and your thoughts, not because I need the engagement metrics, but because I genuinely want to know how many of you watching this can sense the presence of conditioning in your own consciousness, and whether you believe the original thoughts you hold dear are actually yours, or whether they were planted there by processes you have never been taught to recognize. The conversation continues in the comments, where the real investigation begins.